Good morning. All right, for today's scripture reading, I've chosen to read from the Book of Mormon, Alma chapter 16, verses 143 and 144. And now, as I said concerning faith, faith is not to have a perfect knowledge of things. Therefore, if you have faith, ye hope for things which are not seen, which are true. And now, behold, I say unto you, and I would that ye should remember that God is merciful unto all who believe on his name. Therefore he desireth in the first place that ye should believe, yea, even on his word. All right. Well, first off, I'd like to say thank you for those who provided that amazing music. Your gifts are a blessing and inspiration to each of us. I'd also like to say thanks to Greg for helping me prepare for this morning. I really appreciate it. I've known Greg his entire life. That might have something to do with the fact that our last names are very similar, but it's been a real honor knowing him for as long as I have. I was trying to think of the last time Greg and I were in front of a church together, and the last time I can remember was actually when Heather and I got married. He was there with me, and so that was a glorious day, but today is a glorious day as well, for we are gathered in the house of the Lord, worshiping together. And that any day that we can do that is absolutely to be celebrated. This morning, I'd like to talk a little bit about faith. And my scripture reading from the Book of Mormon was obviously a clue to that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about faith. Not too much. There's been entire books written about faith, and there's no way I can get through all of that in one morning. But at least wanted to share some thoughts that I have regarding the subject. And I'm going to use that as kind of a launching point to talk about some personal testimonies that I've had regarding faith. And then we'll wrap things up. So when I mention faith, and I think most people, when they're trying to define faith, can think of two main scriptures. There are two that are very popular. One can be found in Hebrews, and one can be found in Ephesians. I've been told by some sources that when speakers get up and reference something and move on, that's probably not appropriate, and I think that's good advice. So I'm going to read from Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So when somebody says, what is faith? Hopefully most of us can say, there's faith right there. Pretty plain and simple, in good simple language. I'm going to get to Ephesians later, so I haven't broken my rule. So that's coming up, so be looking for that. If I forget, I'm sorry. But faith is very important. As a religion, faith is the first principle of a religion. We all know that. It's the foundation of all righteousness. It's the first step that we need to get to know God and get closer to him. Faith is a gift from God, born from the Spirit of truth, that works within our souls and illuminates our lives. And I think that's a very important concept to get, that faith comes from God. Faith is not an unnatural concept, however. Sometimes people think that, when they talk about a leap of faith, it's a giant leap to get there. But it's not. Faith is something that permeates our everyday lives, whether that's talking about religion and our experience with God, or just in general. So if we want to assess something, generally, there are three ways that we can accomplish this. One is we can believe something because it's evident to our senses. So some people like to fish. I don't like to fish. And I don't know why I came up with this example, but I did, and it stuck. So bear with me. If I go out and catch a fish, which will never happen, if I go out and catch a fish and I want to know how big that fish is, I can get out my scale. And as long as my scale, I know it's calibrated, I can weigh that fish, and I can say that fish weighs, X amount of weight. Okay? The next thing is we can believe something because of our reason and our experience. if I caught a lot of fish and I measured them consistently and I got an idea of, how much does, a fish this big feels about this much, I can get a reasonable estimation. And, for the most part, it's pretty good. So we can, use our senses and our experience, and we can establish things. But these are not faith, okay? We are actually directly, identifying, how much something weighs or how much something is. But there is another way. You can believe something someone told you. For example, my brother actually does like to fish. And so if he goes out and catches a fish and then he's telling me about it, and he says, yeah, I caught an 8-pound bass. I actually had to Google how much a good sized bass is because I have no idea. I guess 8 pounds is kind of considered a trophy fish. Okay, that's impressive. Good job. I have no reason to doubt him, but he caught an 8-pound fish, and now I know that he caught an 8-pound fish. So believing something on the word or testimony of someone else is a type of faith. But that is not saying that you're believing without any evidence at all, okay? But it's a different kind of evidence, okay? It's a kind of a third way that we can believe that. But this makes faith an ordinary part of life. This is something that we all encounter. And it goes even further than that. It's not just talking about a fish and things like that. Everything we do on a daily basis has some matter of faith in it. And I've come up with several examples. I'll go through a few of them, but this, of course, is not an exhaustive list. You can think about other things as I go along. Let's talk about, I don't know much about fishing, like I said, but let's talk about something I do know about. If somebody is sick or injured, they might choose to go see a medical provider and get assistance with that. Some people don't, and that's fine. Everybody has their own opinions and things, and I get that. But some people will go to see a medical provider. And sometimes, as a medical provider, we might give medication. We might, do things like surgery. And what we're doing is we're literally giving potentially toxic chemicals and cutting on people and doing things that, that would necessarily require faith on that person. So that person going to see their provider has to have a certain level of faith that as they, take these chemicals, take these, get their bodies cut on, etc. Moving on, my wife, she speaks Spanish. If we're watching a show and they start talking Spanish and the subtitles say, speaking Spanish, I can look to her and say, hey, what'd they say? And she could tell me what they said. So I don't necessarily always confirm exactly. I, believe that because of her experience that she can translate and give me the idea. And again, being in the context of the show, and sure, that is a type of faith. Again, these are very basic things. When a scientist or an individual is reading journals and reviewing scientific literature, typically don't recreate every single experiment that you read about, okay? There has to be some type of faith involved because there is no time to sit down and there's not the resources to reproduce every single experiment. And even at the expense of personal risk, we exercise faith, okay? So, for instance, traveling, getting on a bus, getting on a train, getting in your car, requires faith. Getting on an airplane requires a huge amount of faith because you're getting in a metal tube being launched hundreds of miles an hour through the air and, piloted by a person, and the airlines are telling you, don't worry about it, you'll get there, and okay. So we strap in, we go, we land, go about our business. That is faith, even though we all know that historically there have been tragedies. But when we travel, every time we travel, we are exercising a certain amount of faith. If you want to get even more simple, If I met somebody, let's say I met Greg for the first time, okay? Say we weren't cousins, and I just run across him, and I say, "Hi, my name is Chris." He says, "Hi, my name is Greg." And I say, "Prove it." How does that make any sense, right? I mean, sure, he could be lying to me about his name. I can make him show me his driver's license. Well, you fake that. Fine. He goes and gets his parents. His parents say, "Yeah, we named him Greg." You're lying, okay? It doesn't work. We have to have a certain level of faith, or we don't function. So lectures of faith kind of relate this principle. It says, and I quote, "Would you have ever sown if you had not believed that you would reap? Would you have ever planted if you had not believed that you would gather?" So this goes to show just how central faith is in our human lives. Okay, faith is natural, it's inescapable, it's just a part of life. And without it, individuals and societies could not function. Okay? So if we did not exercise faith on a daily basis, we would not be functional. We would not be able to do the things that we need to do to live our lives. Okay? So faith is not unreasonable. We can say, yes, faith is a very, very reasonable concept. Okay? It's a very natural phenomenon. However, I must caveat that by we must be careful to consider sources and motivations behind those sources. Yes, people can lie to you. Okay? You have to have a certain amount of skepticism. You have to understand the motivations of that individual. If, going back to my example, someone is reading literature and they know that this person has published false articles or false information in the past, you're going to say, "Yeah, I'm not going to believe that." Okay? So it doesn't mean having blind faith. There has to be some degree of skepticism. However, as followers of Christ, we can see that there's parallels between faith in our fellow humans and a much greater faith in our God. Lectures of Faith says, "And as faith is the moving cause of all action in temporal concerns, so is it in spiritual." Reading on in 1 John chapter 5, verse 9 says, "If we receive the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. For this is the witness of God, which he has testified of his Son." So it is reasonable to have faith in our human witnesses, despite our own shortcomings, despite the shortcomings of others. But how much more reasonable is it to have faith in the Word of God, who is infallible, who will not lie to us, okay? Who doesn't make mistakes. So it is extremely reasonable in that sense. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to go back. I promised I'd get back to Ephesians. Okay, so Ephesians chapter 6, verse 16. Chapter 6, if you all recall, talks about the armor of God. Okay? And verse 16 specifically says, "Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked." Okay? So if you read that whole chapter, clearly this is talking about a spiritual armor. Okay? The putting on to protect ourselves from wicked influences in our life. Faith being one of those. But on another hand, I would presume that to suggest that faith can protect us from physical harm as well. And this is where I want to move into some of my testimonies, some personal things. So as you may or may not know, I was in the Air Force for 20-some years. Retired from that life and moved on. But certainly it was, very interesting experience. And I want to take this time just a second to thank the veterans, for your service to our country and everything that you've done. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate it. But as you know, being in the military, they send you places. It could be good places. Being, stationed in Germany was an excellent opportunity. We got to, form a branch there with other saints, and it was an excellent opportunity to see things and to witness in another country. I was sent to Jerusalem for a short time. Got to actually go walk the steps of Jesus, and that was a very powerful experience, of course. Got to go to Belize on a humanitarian mission, climb the pyramids there in the Book of Mormon lands. That was amazing. But unfortunately, on the flip side of that coin is there's other places that are not as desirable that you can end up. And I unfortunately found myself in those places a few times. And the Lord is good because I am here standing before you now. And I think back, and it's, again, very emotional, and I'm sorry. I'll get it together. I will. So one instance, this was early on in the beginning days of Afghanistan. We had rolled in, found myself deployed to the mountains of Afghanistan. And in those days, things were very austere. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure, a lot of communication. It was pretty rough living in a tent, eating military rations, the whole bit. But in order to improve communications within the intelligence community, the intelligence agencies would gather together from all over the country. They'd travel to meet at the NATO base at the Kabul International Airport. And those roads leading out of the mountains were sometimes treacherous, filled with potentially bad things. So when they would convoy out, they would request medical support. And so occasionally that fell to me. And most of the time it was pretty uneventful. We would get in the vehicles, take our convoy, we'd go to Kabul. They'd have their meeting. I'd kind of hang out. We'd drive back, and nothing happened. One day, we're driving in. It seems routine, just like normal. And I was with the convoy commander, and he leans over to me and was like, "Doc, just so you know, we're going to make a quick stop." And what I hear him tell me is, this will just be a couple minutes, but you're not allowed to go with us. You're going to stay and help guard the convoy. Okay, fine. When we stop, we pull into this side street. If you think about Kabul, what you might think about what it looks like, that's exactly what it looks like. So everybody gets out of the convoy, and suddenly I look around, and I am literally the only one standing on the street with these vehicles. And I realize, he didn't tell me help guard the convoy. He said, you are going to guard the convoy. And by myself. And I'm like, at first it was shocking. I was taken aback. I'm like, wow. And then a sense of vulnerability came over me. Some might call that fear. But then anger built up, because I was like, how could anybody think this was a good idea to let a physician guard a convoy in the middle of the streets of Kabul? And that rage just built up and built up. And I was pretty sure that I was also violating a Geneva Convention, being a non-combatant, providing a guard duty. James, you're nodding your head, so I know I'm right. So that made me incredibly mad. And my heart rate was going up, my vision was blurry, and I realized that's not a good situation to be in. And so the only thing I could do at that moment was just say a prayer. And when I did, this calmness rushed over me. My heart rate started to normalize. My vision came back. And I was at peace, which is very odd because of where I was, to be at peace in such a situation. But, it was probably just a couple minutes, but it seemed like hours. Eventually, the rest of my individuals came back. We got in. We went on to the base, and nothing happened. And that, in and of itself was a blessing. But, in that moment, the Lord was there for me. And I know that was because of the faith and the prayers of my family. And this will be a kind of a running theme throughout this. So in that instance, yes, I was in a bad situation, but the Lord got me through it, and nothing happened, and okay. But what about those instances where I actually was in physical danger? Another instance, again, found myself in Afghanistan again. In those days, there was a lot of injuries that required certain types of medical equipment. And we found our hospital, at that point, I was working for a large hospital there in Afghanistan, and we ran out of equipment. And unfortunately, things were not going to end well. So we were gathering together in a meeting to try to decide what we could do. And when the logistics officer says, hey, it's too bad because I know a buddy over in Iraq that has a ton of these. They're just sitting around. But unfortunately, to get things moved from one country to another is just almost insurmountable. And so I thought about it, and I went up to the commander afterwards, and I said, hey, look, I have an idea. It's crazy, but I have an idea. I said, I'm 100% comfortable. I know how to fly. The routes to get in and out of Iraq, I could be back within 48 hours at most with a handful of these things. And he said, do it. So I went on my way. I started flying, picked my way through the air routes, eventually landing in Iraq. And as soon as we landed in Iraq, the base was going on lockdown because they were receiving, an attack from the outside. So didn't have time to get to a bunker, so we just kind of huddled up in the plane and hoped for the best. And again, nothing really happened. But that made the pilot in command kind of nervous, and so that kind of set a tone for the rest of the trip. We had a couple more stops. I got the equipment that we needed, came back, got back on the plane, and we went to other stops. And as we were doing so, the pilot, of course, like I said, was kind of nervous because of what we had just gone through. And so he elected to do an engine running offload of the cargo that we were dropping off and then getting back on, which means the engines are running, everybody's working really quickly because we got to move quickly. So I'm standing there they unload the cargo. I'm in the cargo bay of a C-17. Got the rest of the crew with. We're just kind of standing around watching what's going on, letting the ground crew do their thing. Co-pilot's up in the cockpit because the engines are running. But they're trying to get everybody to hurry. So we're standing there, the pallets come on, the cargo containers come on, and in order to keep these cargo containers basically from shifting around in flight due to turbulence, hard landings, those kind of things, they have these large chains that they attach, and they have these points on the floor which they attach into. And so they're there. The chains, the links are probably made of steel about as big around as my finger, so big, heavy chains to hold these thousands of pounds of cargo containers in place. So they're there, they're cranking on these things, and all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, I heard this voice. It was an audible, distinct voice that said, I needed to move, like, right now. And it was so distinctive, and it was so compelling and imperative that I had no choice but to follow it. So I'm like, wow, it just kind of was like, okay. So I turned to take a step, and as soon as I did, there was a loud bang. And that chain had suffered a structural integrity failure, and it was under so much tension that it whipped forward, and that link that broke whizzed right by my head, like literally, like a bullet. Embedded itself in the upper bulkhead of the cargo bay. And I immediately fell to the ground because of reflex, because it was that fast, and I just crumpled. And then I remember sitting up, like, what just happened? And everything kind of replayed back in my mind. Of course, everybody had gathered around because they thought that I basically was dead at that point because of the way I crumpled. But it, because of that voice, because I am convinced that, my guardian angel was there, basically telling me at the exact point which I needed to move. And that's what saved me from certain harm. And so for that, again, the faith of my family members back home praying for me, my personal faith, I think is what got me through that. So, that's a very, basically, a story that shows that, yes, God can intervene at a moment's notice and, allow us to be protected. But this next one, this is where things get really interesting. So, again, sorry for the redundancy. I'm back in Afghanistan again. I've been tasked with going down to pick up a patient from base. It's a stable patient, no rush. So, they say just take the next flight out in the morning. So I get up the next morning. I get dressed. I go get some chow, head over to meet up with the crew. We get on the plane. We fly down to our destination. We got some passengers with us, got some cargo. Again, not a big deal. This is just kind of routine. cargo goes off, passengers goes off, new passengers start to come on. I find my patient, meet up with them, introduce myself, basically say, hey, this is where we're sitting, got them situated. Then once the passengers are in, this is in a C-130, so a little bit smaller plane, but still a large cargo plane, and the pallets start coming on. So the first pallet that comes on is kind of a low pallet, probably about, you guys can see me about this high off the ground. It comes on, and then it's a bunch of crates or something. I don't even know what it was, but it was pretty low. It comes on. The next thing on is one of these large cargo containers, kind of like what I was talking about in the previous testimony. Thousands of pounds cargo container comes getting shoved onto this plane, basically filling up the entire cargo bay. So I don't know how many people they had on the other side. I'm guessing it was probably one person trying to shove this thing up into this cargo bay. Doesn't get very far. And so I'm standing there, the loadmaster's standing there, he kind of gives me a nod like, hey, let's go give him a hand. So I grab one of the handles and go to pull. Well, in that moment, I guess the individual on the other side had recruited a bunch of people to come up and help him. So as we're pulling, suddenly this thing just lurches forward. So the loadmaster and I, we go to jump out of the way. Well, unfortunately, my foot was probably farther forward or just bigger, and it gets caught underneath this pallet that's suddenly lurching forward. So now I have thousands of pounds coming at me and no way to get out of the way. It is momentarily about to make contact with my squishy body, which will inevitably throw me into that low pallet, which happens to be about as far away as my head is. And that's probably not going to end well. But as you can tell, that didn't happen. So how did that not happen? I'm going to back the story up just a little bit. Well, just a lot of it. Before I got deployed, we got a bunch of gear. And most of that gear was, just emergency stuff like chemical gear, chem mask, chem suit. One of those happened to be a certain type of boots, steel-toe boots. Those were shoved in my bag up underneath my bed, my bunk. That morning, when I went to get dressed, for some reason, I felt utterly compelled to get on my knees, get underneath that bunk, and grab those boots out of there. Now, that is a complete violation of flying standards because steel-toe boots are not allowed for aircrew. And I knew that. I am a rule follower, okay? But for some reason, I was just super compelled that I'm going to wear steel-toe boots. And I didn't know why, but that just happened. It wasn't a mistake. I didn't miss, they weren't next to my other ones, and I just happened to grab the wrong ones. I knowingly had to get these boots out of there. So, going back to my story, now this thing is coming at me. My foot's trapped underneath it, but because I'm wearing steel-toe boots, the corner of that pallet rises up, and it pushes down, the thousands of pounds push down on that steel cup, which pushes against my rubber sole, basically effectively creating a break for that container. And it basically doesn't make contact with me. So there I am. I'm stuck underneath. The loadmaster had jumped out. He got out to the other side. So not only did God protect me from physical harm, he also protected my ego too, because I'm the only one there that can see this. And I could hear people like, what's going on? So I stuck my head around and said, hey, I think it came off the track. If you pull it back, it should reseat. They're like, okay. So they pulled it back, it reseated, got my foot out. I got out of the way. Thing came on. And I'm trying to smash the leather back down on top of the steel because I don't want anybody to know. But the Lord protected me, not just in an instant, but months before, okay? Again, the faith of prayer and prayers of my family members definitely had a play in that. Hebrews 11:3 says, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. So in other words, the scripture is describing faith kind of as in a reverse sense. As opposed to hoping for things that might come, this is saying that there are things that God does which will become evident later. So in other words, So we need to be willing to trust God in all that we do. Though we can't necessarily see how his plan will work out, we need to have faith that he will do what's best for us. So spiritually as well as physically, God takes what is unseen to us and makes things which will be evident in hindsight. So referencing that last testimony, I was given an object months before. It was put under my bunk out of the way, but I had to pull that out, knowingly violating regulations of the United States Air Force. But that was the precise object which allows me to be standing in front of you today, unharmed. Again, through faith, all things are possible. So in summary, I want to summarize. Faith is not an unreasonable concept, and hopefully I made that point pretty evident. It is reasonable to have faith in God. It is more reasonable to have faith in God because he is infallible. People can make mistakes, but God will not make mistakes. And through faith, God guides us, he blesses us, and he protects us. So with that, I would like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. It's a real honor to be able to stand before you with my fellow saints and to worship the Lord and God who is loving and will bless us as long as we have faith in him.